Okay, so today we're going to look at Luke chapter 6. And just a reminder of a couple of things here. Number one, we saw that, at least according to Jeremias, that Luke will use his sources in chunks, that in particular Mark. He chunks Mark. So he'll use his special source and maybe a little Matthew in there like he does in, Luke 1 through 5. But now we're in this big chunk of Mark from 5:12 through 6:20. He's just kind of following Mark at this point, whereas Matthew's going to divvy up that section a little bit. But as we move toward the end of this section of this chunk of Mark, Luke is then going to go in and redact or edit Matthew's Sermon on the Mount and put it right here in Luke 6, beginning in verse 20. Now, there's a whole mass of other material in the Sermon on the Mount that's going to be delayed until that travel narrative that begins in 951 and goes through 1914. That whole center section that we saw is about the motif of the journeying Mosaic prophet and how he's rejected, and then the consequences of that. And that whole central section now is going to contain a whole bunch of the Sermon on the Mount. But at this point in Luke 6, and beginning in verse 20, we're going to have what we've been referring to as that substratum, that ethical piece of the gospel. Okay? But before we get there, we do want to look at a few things that are occurring in Luke before this actually happened. So we're actually going to begin back noting. I have so many books open here on my table, it isn't funny. That from verse 12, when Luke starts following Mark in chapter 5, we have the healing of the leper, and that leper is told to go bear witness, and I noted that it could be to bear witness against the whole temple priestly system, which was seen as the place of healing, the font of healing, that in fact healing was occurring outside of that system. So there is a direct challenge there in Luke 5. Then we get to the healing and forgiving of a paralytic, which at least raises a question that is not halakhic in nature. That is, it's not about the interpretation of Torah. This has to do with the question of authority. Where does Jesus' authority come from? But it too, along with the previous narrative, is juxtaposing Jesus with these institutions, whether temple or the religious leadership. So Jesus is being juxtaposed not against Judaism. Okay? But remember, there are multiple Judaisms. He's being juxtaposed against this religious institution and this religious hierarchy. And doesn't always mean that this hierarchy, like the Pharisees, they didn't always cooperate with the Sadducees. And we see all throughout their history. I mean, it's a bloody history, right? But here, they're bunched together as antagonists. We move from there in Luke to the call of Levi, and what it means for Jesus to eat with sinners. And then we come right back to this whole business of the superiority of the new versus the old, with that little section there about the bride and the bridegroom, the wine and the wineskins. So that conflict that we see in chapter 5 is now giving way to a recognition that something new is here. And indeed, it's eschatological. There's an awful lot of eschatological themes I have just skipped over as we've been reading through Luke. But one of them, of course, in with the bridegroom would be the notion of the messianic wedding feast of Isaiah 25 or the book of the Revelation. This understanding at the end of time, Messiah is going to just, everything's going to be glorious, and we're going to have Thanksgiving and Christmas and Easter all rolled into one, and then we're all going to have to go on a diet. All right. So immediately contrasting the Old and New, we come to two narratives. The questions are now halakhic in nature. Can the disciples pluck grain or not on the Sabbath? Is that considered work? Is that considered labor? And remember, you have your different interpretations of Torah, your different halakha, your different holiness codes, just like you do in Christianity today. Some people say you can do this, others say you can't. Some people say you can't do this, others say you can. Different groups have different halakhic codes, okay? Same thing in Jesus' day. But there were some dominant ones, and there were some of these halakhic battles had formalized over the decades, and we're still now being debated within the schools. And by halakhic, I mean an interpretation of Torah. And this, by the way, becomes really important in Galatians because of a phrase we found in the Dead Sea Scrolls. And I've been over this with you before, this little piece here, this rabbit trail. But when Paul talks about works of the law, it's a phrase that translates from the Dead Sea Scrolls having to do with the halakha of the community. It's the community's halakha is their works of the law. Their interpretation of the law is their, quote, works of the law. And Paul says we were justified by trust, not by interpretations. That's Paul's argument in Galatians, okay? But we're going to come back to here, to this issue. The issue has to do with the healing of the paralytic, and then now the healing of a man with a withered hand. And this is on the Sabbath. And so we have, the plucking of grain and the healing of the man on the Sabbath. Both of these are halakhic in nature. Okay? This is only important because when we get to Luke 6 and we start comparing Luke's Sermon on the Plain to Matthew's Sermon on the Mount, one of the things we're going to observe is how much of the halakhic material that's in Matthew's Sermon on the Mount that is specifically Jewish material oriented to interpretation of Jewish Torah. We're going to see how much of that is completely ignored by Luke, both in his Sermon on the Plain as well as later on in the Gospel. Those are strictly Jewish questions that are to be found in Matthew's Gospel. Luke understands this. He's writing for Gentiles, and so he's just going to omit these because their discourse on these topics is going to be entirely different. Now, prior to the Sermon on the Plain, and this is in Matthew as well, prior to the Sermon on the Mount, you have the calling of the 12. And so if you'll turn in your Bibles, for example, to 6:12. Okay. In 6:12, you have the choosing of the 12. Okay. And you'll notice that for the most part, if you were to look at Matthew, Mark, and Luke, they're very similar. Mark starts off, and he went up on the mountain and called to him those whom he desired. Matthew has, and he called to himself his 12 disciples and gave them authority. So Mark is presupposing that Jesus at that point makes the calling. Matthew now has said, that they're already known as little colloquia. Luke has, in these days, he went out to the mountain to pray. And all night he continued in prayer to God. And when it was day, he called his disciples and chose from among them 12, whom he named apostles. Now, this is very different than Mark and Luke. Mark just simply says he called to himself those whom he desired, and they came to him, and he appointed 12 to be with him, and he's to be sent out to preach and have authority to cast out demons. Matthew, the same thing. He called to him his 12 disciples, gave them authority over unclean spirits to cast them out and heal every disease and infirmity. And then they go to the list of names. But let's look at Luke again first. In Luke, Jesus spends the whole night in prayer before he picks these 12 men. And they are men. Sorry, ladies, but that's the way it is. I can't change history. He goes all night in prayer. And this is, again, we notice this, that we see Jesus doing this frequently in the other Gospels as well, but especially in Luke. Jesus is the one who's taking time out away from his ministry, has a Sabbath, away, time with the Father, back and forth. There is that rhythm. But when it's day, he calls to himself the 12. And Luke says he calls these apostles. Now, remember what Luke is doing, okay? He's writing a text that for himself, again, whether as a companion of Paul or a friend of a companion of Paul, someone that would have had the travelogue that's used later in Acts, doesn't matter at this point. He's still very Pauline. Is going to establish this apostolic community of which he's going to make Paul a part in his book of Acts. Okay, so he's establishing this apostolic community. Now, there's not much to note here about the lists, except to note that there are some interesting things that go on with this list of names. The first of which is that only Mark and Luke have any record that the name that's given of a person also has either a nickname or an epithet, or perhaps in both cases that we'll note, there's a certain pejorativeness to it. So the first one occurs when we note that Matthew, Mark, and Luke, and John pretty much all name the first four: Peter and Andrew, James and John, the sons of Zebedee. Peter, Andrew, James, and John. 1/3 of them right there, straight up front in that block. It's across the board in the record. Okay, and of course the fourth gospel would have you know the beloved disciple was actually there before that. But at any rate, the beloved disciple is not from Galilee. The rest of these men are Galileans. And so that's where Jesus is. He's up in Galilee. And so he's going to name his 12. Now, the 12, of course, probably have to do with a form of representation of the 12 tribes of Israel. Jesus is reforming Israel. There's that eschatological thinking going on here in the number 12. And the commentaries and scholars will take you around the literature and show you that Jesus is doing this new community thing, this realization, this awareness of the dawning of the reign of God amongst the 12 tribes of Israel. So he's gathering to himself these 12. After in Mark, after we get mention of James and John, Mark says that Jesus surnamed them Boanerges, that is, sons of thunder. And Gustav Dalman, in his book way back at the beginning of the 20th century, he was the great Aramaist that was the father figure to Joachim Jeremias, who was the second great Aramaist of the 20th century. But Dalman says that Boanerges retranslates into an Aramaic phrase, which means sons of wrath or sons of rage. Okay. And of course, we will encounter later in Luke's gospel, this is from Mark, I'm telling you this, but in Luke's gospel, we will encounter these two ready to bring the wrath of God down on a Samaritan village. And Jesus says, you don't know what manner of spirit you are. You got this thing bass backwards. At any rate, that's a pejorative name, the raging boys. You know, I mean, James and John are known as the raging boys. And then the Simon in this list, who's known as a Canaanites, a Canaanite, Luke has him as a zealot. Okay, now the zelotes would have been like a nickname. So, for example, in the Greek text, you have, and Simon, the one called, ton chluomenon, zelote, the zealot. And you have this again in the Gospels. Mary, the one called Magdalene. In other words, that was her nickname. They didn't call her Miriam when they wanted to tell Jesus about her. They said, the Magdalene's calling you, the woman from Magdala. You know, it's kind of like the lady from the Bronx wants you, you know. Okay. So when you have that, the one called, it's a nickname. And in this case, zealot is another way of saying hothead. So 3 of the 12, at a minimum, of Jesus' original 12 are eschatological hotheads. They're ready to bring the wrath of the world, and Tim LaHaye and Daniel Jenkins' prophecies come true right now on everybody. And we won't talk about the rest of the sociological mix of that group because, as you know, it also contains a tax collector, and tax collectors and zealots and raging sons typically aren't going to get along that well. But interestingly, the gospel never records any conflict between those disciples. All right, so now we move from the choosing of the 12. What comes next? You have this calling, and then you have this didache, this teaching. Calling, teaching. Calling is first, didache is second. This is the pattern of the early Christian catechetical practice. One is called by the Lord to follow him. One learns how to follow. It's the same pattern, because we're entering now into that ethical substratum. Now, at this point, I want to bring in the didache, the actual didache, when we are doing our comparisons here with Matthew and with Luke. But before I do that, I want to read a bit of a text to you from Aaron Milovich's 1,000-page commentary on the little didache. It's as exhaustive as you can get, and I am in fundamental agreement with about 95-98% of his thesis. I don't follow his thesis when it comes to nonviolence. I think he misreads the whole nonviolence piece, but at any rate, this is what Milovich has to say about this process. It's on page 76, should you ever get this book. The didache offers evidence suggesting that each novice was paired off with a single spiritual master. The principal clue for this is the fact that the entire training program, save for didache 1-3, the very beginning, addresses a single novice using the second person singular. That is, you have you in the singular in Greek, and you have you in the plural in Greek, and they look different. The didache is using you in the singular. It's just, if you know German, it's the difference between du and sie. Okay. If under normal circumstances a single spiritual master was assigned the training of many or all the novices within a community, one would have expected that the second person plural would have been used throughout. Furthermore, within the Way of Life training program, the novice was instructed to actively mull and remember over the life and training of the one speaking to you the word of God. That is, in the didache, the novice or the follower is to look at the life of the one training them. The use of the singular here points in the direction of each novice having a single master. So too, when regulations are put forward for choosing the water for baptism and for ordering the one being baptized to fast beforehand, in each case, the singular is used. Again, confirming the expectation that each candidate was baptized individually by a single individual. Now, I bring that out because one of the reasons I am persuaded that the Gospels came into existence at the great crisis of the Roman war, at the death of so many in the apostolic community, or the flight of the rest, was that the model, the models were gone. And we needed that written text of the story of Jesus. We needed that model. And I think it's one of the reasons we have the 4 versions of this model we do. So we come through this business of the choosing, and now we're going to get into Luke's Sermon on the Plain. Now, there are 2 interesting things you can do here in your, if you have a synopsis. I had recommended to you before a synopsis of the 4 Gospels. You can either start with Matthew's Sermon on the Mount and look at the other column and see what Luke has left out, okay? Or you can follow Luke's order to see what he leaves out. When I began this, I followed the actual just physical text. It starts with Matthew. Now, I want to deal with one question here that Richard has brought up. It's very important because we're going to get to it right off the bat, and that's the question of, is there any kind of Second Temple eschatological thinking in this text? So I want to look at, in particular, a couple of verses that Richard has brought up and show that I can understand why someone could read them through that framework, but I don't think they are. The first has to do with the Beatitudes. Of course, they're shortened forms of Matthew's versions. There are less of them. As you just have 4 Beatitudes in Luke as compared to the 8 in Matthew. But in Luke, you also have these woes, okay? So when you get from blessed are you poor, for the kingdom of God belongs to you, blessed are you who hunger now. There's no meek in here. There's no poor in spirit. Blessed are you who hunger now. Blessed are you who weep now. Blessed are you when people hate you, okay? So these Beatitudes have been cribbed, edited, and now they aren't conforming so much as Matthew's do to the Psalter. Matthew's Beatitudes use a lot of phrasing from the Psalter, the book of Psalms. Luke, just right now, we're just ABBA, kind of just laying out these basic axioms here in this Didache. Now notice verses 24 to 26 introduce a series of woes. So what are these woes? Well, these woes sound pretty familiar if you remember chapter 1 and 2. Woe to you who are rich, for you've received your comfort already. Now, the songs in the birth narratives see this eschatological overturning. And to be sure, by the time we get to chapter 16, we're going to be told a story about a rich guy who had a poor leper hanging out at his gate. And when they got to the afterlife, they found, well, gee, things are really different. And but you have that. But is this Second Temple eschatology? Let me just remind you that when you come to judgment scenes and judgment in Second Temple eschatology, you have to differentiate between the, quote, historical judgment that is from the perspective of the writers, these eschatological battles where the Gentiles are getting wiped out. That's taking place on the level of history. Then there is this divine or theological judgment that's also now part of the package thinking of those who are seeking in Israel to be the faithful remnant. And it's that eschatological judgment that's going to include judgment scenes where there are weights and balances and checks and balances and these kinds of things, okay? So the gospel doesn't seem to indicate that that particular way of viewing things is correct. You don't have weights and balances of good deeds and bad deeds about following the halakha. Okay, did you do what you were supposed to do and stay away from the things you were supposed to stay away from? Well, then good for you, you win. Okay, the Christian scenario, the gospel scenario of this eschatological judgment is radically defined, not just in Luke or John or Mark. I mean, Mark 13, God is not, there's no God present in that apocalyptic scenario. Luke, as we're going to see, has his way of framing it. It's similar to Matthew's, a little different. John, of course, the eschatological moment's the cross, when the Satan, death, everything else is taken out of existence, and the resurrection, where everything new is birthed. Matthew 2 has quite an ameliorated and interesting judgment scene in the parable of the sheep and the goats, okay? Because this has the virtue ethic that's found in the parable of the sheep and the goats that concludes really the Gospel of Matthew, because chapter 26 begins the Passion narrative. This parable of the sheep and the goats is not about weights and balances in terms of halakha, but precisely about how one treated those who had been marginalized by society, truly marginalized by society, okay? And this is not some kind of Black Lives Matter movement thing or any identification with any kind of alphabet community. This has nothing to do with that. It has everything to do with even those groups who are going to look down upon the most destitute. That's who those groups represent, the most destitute neighbor you have. How do you relate to the most destitute neighbor you have? That's what that text is dealing with. That is what judgment is predicated upon in Matthew. And the beautiful thing about that is the symmetry in that parable. The sheep and the goat said identically the same exact things. We didn't see you, Lord. We didn't see you. And then the goat's going to say, if we'd have seen you, hey, we'd have taken care of you, because we'll always take care of you. We like this religious piece. And Jesus says, no, 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 no. The sheep said, we never saw you. We were doing this in your name. And Jesus says, as much as you did it to these, you did it to me. That's that Matthean judgment. Again, very different than what you're going to find in First Enoch or the Dead Sea Scrolls or the intertestamental and other pseudepigraphal literature. It's very different, okay? It's not this great white throne where the books are open kind of thing, okay? And if it is, well, all I can hope is that nobody taught God to read, but actually the concept of the end-time judgment as a ledger was put to rest completely by the Apostle Paul, who says in 2 Corinthians 5, God is not an accountant. God was in Christ reconciling the world to himself. How? By not keeping a ledger, not counting their sins against them. God keeps no ledger. God's not an accountant. So Paul eliminates that from his eschatology. That's gone. Are these woes here to be understood then in terms of Second Temple retributive eschatology? The answer is no. What are they to be understood as? Well, let's read what we have here in Luke. But woe to you who are rich, you have received your comfort already. In other words, you have your reward. You wanted to be rich, you wanted the benefits of being rich, you got it. You got it, but you have not sown for yourself any benefits in the next life. So sorry, you're on welfare, right? Woe to you who are well satisfied with food now, because in the next life, you're going to be out there. You're going to be one that's wanting the scraps from the table. That's that reversal image, to be sure. Okay. Woe to you who laugh now, for you will mourn and weep. Why? I mean, if you made it into the kingdom, why? Because your whole existence is about being top dog, number one, and now you are getting to be the butler. And you knew what it was like to be number one. Woe to you when all people speak well of you. Their ancestors did the same thing to the false prophets. And now this whole thing suddenly becomes religious. Okay. Then I would say, in answer to Richard's question, there's a fundamental difference between judgment with retribution, or even judgment by weights and measures, balances and scales, ledgers. There's a fundamental difference between that and what I would understand as the having to reckon with consequences. And in this case, consequences is not some penally burning hellfire thing. No. They're obviously still within the kingdom, but they're hungry. They're obviously still within the kingdom, but they lack comfort. They're obviously still within the kingdom, but they're mourning and weeping. You know, it doesn't say that they're cast into some eternal fire. It just says that for those upon whom the reign of God comes, they are given an opportunity to change their eschatological future. And we're going to have a story about this in Luke. Little short guy sits in a sycamore tree named Zacchaeus, remember? Right? Zacchaeus gives away half his wealth, and he pays back with some very good interest those he's defrauded. But he's still a wealthy man, right? If you got $1 billion and you give away 600 million, you still got 400 million. Okay, he's still a wealthy man. He doesn't cease to be wealthy any more than Joseph of Arimathea ceases to be wealthy, or others in the early church. This notion that in the early church, you had this little communist experiment that takes place in the book of Acts, and everybody gave up everything. That's, first of all, not realistic. Second of all, it didn't last. If in fact Jesus dies in April of 33, if Pentecost is in early June of 33 and Paul's converted in October of 34, by the time we begin this little experiment, it's already blown apart by the time we get to the Hebrew Hellenist problem of Acts chapter 6 and the major discord that occurs between the Hellenists and the Hebrews and eventuates in the stoning of Stephen and the conversion of Saul. So I don't know. I'm going to say that from my perspective, I can read this text and it doesn't have to have that second temple eschatological orientation. So when we compare Matthew and Luke, first of all, you'll notice that Matthew's is on a mountain, Luke's on a level plain. All right, just saying. After we've dealt with the Beatitudes, there's the saying about salt. But Matthew's is, you are the salt of the earth. All Luke has simply is, salt is good. If it loses its taste, how shall its saltiness be restored? Which is a saying that also can be found in the Gospel of Mark chapter 9. It was evidently part of a free-floating tradition. Or Matthew has taken it from Mark 9 and in his midrashic technique, inserted it here in the Sermon on the Mount, and Luke is simply following at that point. At any rate, now we're into the Didache, okay? So this Didache is going to begin with these blessings and these woes, okay? And then it's going to move to, if you're salt, and you lose your saltiness, how do you get salted again? In other words, you got one shot at this thing of discipleship. You get one shot at it. Okay, one really clear, good shot at it. This is what it's all about here. Now, Luke has no light of the world stuff. Luke lacks that whole section of the Sermon on the Mount that starts off with, don't think I've come to destroy the law and prophets, and goes all the way down until unless your righteousness exceeds that of the Pharisees. Luke has none of that. When it comes to the first, what's the word I'm looking? Antithesis. You have heard it said, but I say unto you, what do we have? Nothing. Nothing when it comes to on murder and wrath. Okay. We have a little now, it gets brought in. Why do you not judge for yourselves what is right? Again, following this section, but that's not really paralleled in Matthew, except where both of them have this little narrative about, if your accuser takes you to trial, make up with him on the road before he gets you there, and you end up getting thrown in the clink, and they won't let you out till you pay the last penny. Okay, then they both have that little piece. That is, reconciliation is very important. So you're the salt of the earth, and then boom, right away in Luke, reconciliation is very important. The whole section in Matthew on adultery and divorce, not here in Luke at all. That's a halakhic question. Are we allowed? What constitutes divorce? And we already know that in Mark, Jesus' reply is to basically do something similar to the Essenes and say no divorce. Matthew's Jesus has already bought into the more conservative Shammaiite school. Well, you can get divorced in cases of adultery, which is very different from the Hillelite school, which is you can get divorced if your wife burns your dinner, okay, kind of thing. But all this Jewish halakhic stuff is now left out of Luke's Didache, a very Gentile Didache. There's nothing on oaths or oath keeping. Excuse me. Nothing from the retaliation thing that goes on here at all. Okay. But you do now, when you come into the end of Matthew 5, where it talks about love of enemies, boom, now we're right back following Matthew on this. Love of enemies is also part of this Gentile Didache. See what we're doing? We've got a Jewish Didache here with all the halakhic stuff, but we've got a Gentile Didache here. And what we're noticing are those places that they connect, okay? They connect on the eschatological blessing being given to certain communities. They then they connect again when it comes to the salt saying, you get a shot at this. The reconciliation is the most important thing. Love of one's enemies. And then Luke skips over everything Matthew says about almsgiving, Jewish practice, prayer, Jewish practice, the Lord's Prayer. Now, we know Luke has the Lord's Prayer, but like a lot of other material here from the Sermon on the Mount, it's going to go into the travel narrative. Okay? So you have this Lord's Prayer is gone. Again, the section on fasting. The section on treasures is gone. Okay? The hermeneutic about the sound eye is gone. All this stuff goes into the travel narrative, folks. This is why, and you have to ask why. Why is Luke taking all this Didache material from Matthew, putting it in the travel narrative? Because he is showing you Jesus as this model is living this Didache out, that Jesus is this living Didache. Boom, right in that narrative. And then you come back, finally, after all of this, the section on anxiety and the birds of the air and the lilies of the field, boom, travel narrative, right? But when we come back to Matthew, now we're in chapter 7, don't judge lest you be judged. Forgive and you will be forgiven. And then Luke adds some material. that's not found in Matthew or Mark? Does it come from his source L? Is this redaction? I don't know, but it's added. And that's forgiven. You don't judge, you won't be judged. Forgive, you'll be forgiven. Don't condemn, you won't be condemned. Give, and it will be given to you. Good measure, pressed down, shaken together, running over, and put into your lap. This is not prosperity gospel stuff here. This is the recognition that when you have come to this place where you are not judging anyone and you are forgiving everyone and you're not condemning anyone and you are giving, then the return comes in. Okay? But it has nothing to do with the prosperity gospel. It has everything again to do with this ethical orientation that one is living out, this forgiving life, this nurturing life, this loving life, etc. And there is the whole question about the answering of prayer from Matthew's Sermon on the Mount gets put off until later. The golden rule, okay? Whatever you want people to do to you, you do to them. Bang, right here in the middle of this Didache, just as it is in the actual book, the Didache. I mean, this golden rule is smack dab in the middle of this ethical substratum. Here's how you behave in relation to others. You do to them what you want them to do to you. You're modeling something. It doesn't say you do to them what you want them to do to you until they don't do it, and then you can stop doing it. It doesn't say that, okay? And then again, we move to Luke, skipping material in Matthew until it comes to the section of why do you call me Lord, Lord, and the house built upon the rock. Excuse me. In this whole thing, we've gone from this very clear Matthew 5-7 Sermon on the Mount Jewish Didache to a culling of material that looks an awful lot like Romans chapter 12 and 13. That is, there is a tremendous amount of overlap material there. Although Paul's is again richer and longer, we still have this basic material, this fundamental stuff that remains across the board. And the orientation here in Luke has to do with reconciliation and forgiveness. This is the essential part of this Didache for Luke. So the overall point is we are seeing a shift. We are definitely seeing a shift. There is something happening here. We've seen Jesus come on and heal. We have seen him exorcise demons several times, okay? We have seen what happens to him when this message that he's bringing is rejected because he rejects the concept or the category of divine retribution. Then the community says, okay, then we'll be the retributive ones. And that, again, is also the whole point of the parable of the son who comes to the vineyard and gets killed. So walk away with now this piece in your head, because we're soon going to leave this Markan chunking and Matthean following behind as we move through chapters 6, 7, 8, and 9. We're moving toward that whole central travel narrative. Who is this Jesus? We know he heals. We know he has an authority greater than other authorities. From Luke's Gentile perspective, Jesus is bringing something new, okay? And it's not new in terms of Christianity's juxtaposed to Judaism. That's not how Luke is thinking. Luke is just thinking of something new. And this would even for the Gentiles, who still thought in terms of eternal circles and cycles and all of this stuff. The introduction of an eschatology at this point is got to be mind-blowing enough for them, because they're used to thinking of this eternal circle and history this way. And the biblical way of doing history is to turn it out linear, boom, this way. So you're introducing Gentiles to kind of a new way of thinking about time. And we have to always remember that. I just don't see discussions about this anywhere. But again, it wouldn't have affected the God-fearers, who would have been those in particular, I think, that would have been the most easy to reach with the gospel message when it came to the synagogues. And I will end this here.